Hello and welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche. She's the founder and the chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. I'm Harley Schlanger. It's June 24th, 2022, and we've just come from last weekend's extraordinary Schiller Institute conference on the need for a global bankruptcy reorganization to break from the dying transatlantic financial system. Helga, this was, I think there were 31 speakers from 12 countries, covered a lot of topics, but especially drove home the point that we need a new financial and new security architecture. I wonder if you would like to give us your sense of what came out of the conference, because obviously there's a lot of work to do now.
Well, I think the conference was indeed very important and powerful and is being recognized as such by an increasing number of people around the world. For example, in the first panel, the strategic panel, we had the leaders of two of the most important think tanks from Russia and China. One was Dr. Kotonov from the RIAC, Russian International Affairs Council, which is a think tank associated with the Foreign Ministry. And from China, we had the dean of the Chongyang Financial Institute of the Renmin University, Dr. Wang Wen. And both of them gave a very important and very different view than you hear from the mainstream media about how they judge the strategic situation. And then we had a whole variety of very important speakers, Sam Pitroda, former Indian minister, but also speakers who spoke on the situation in China, otherwise in Afghanistan. And so this was a very important debate, because once you cannot discuss different points of views, then you're a victim of a narrative, and narrative and truth are two very different things. Then we had an excellent economic panel discussing, the actual condition of the world economy, a very enlightening science panel, and a beautiful, beautiful cultural panel where we had absolute pearls, like, for example, a video of the late singer William Warfield singing Zwei Grenadiere, which, given the fact that the war hysteria is right now trying to convince people of all kinds of things, was a very timely intervention. So I would encourage people to watch this conference, because, I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying that this is the kind of all-around discussion you have a very hard time finding anywhere else but with the Schiller Institute. But I think most important was what came out in terms of a discussion that, one has to investigate why is the war danger so acute. And that is naturally something which is not being discussed by even people who oppose the war. But the real reason for the war danger is the fact that the transatlantic neoliberal financial system is completely out of control. I mean, you can see that with all kinds of aspects. You see it with the runaway inflation in food and energy prices in general. But you also see it in an unbelievable collapse of supply lines, of breakdown of, the simplest functions of different parts of the economy. For example, in Germany, wagons of trains are being put on a side track for days. And then naturally the just-in-time does not function. The semi-finished products are not arriving. So, we just agreed out of this conference to issue a call to address that, because it's very clear that the Western governments are not doing anything to remedy the inflation or any of the other hardships. And if you look, the absolute bungling of the German, I really hate to call him economic minister, because he's actually a deconstructionist minister rather than an economic minister. But in any case, he is now causing quite some hysteria by saying, there soon has to be rationing of the gas. He already called the second level of alarm on energy emergency. There is now a big debate in these circles if one should supply the own industry in the coming fall and winter, or keep exporting 35% of the natural gas imported from Russia to the neighbors, which is in contracts, existing contracts. In any case, this is all absolutely are all symptoms that the neoliberal model is completely bankrupt. As a matter of fact, even if nobody in the mainstream politics or media would say that, but I'm saying it, that the neoliberal system is as bankrupt as the communist system was between 89 and 91. And what you now see is the bill which is being presented for all the mistakes of this neoliberal system. For example, outsourcing into cheap labor markets, which was for a very long time a source of big profit. It led to the destruction of highly productive jobs in the industrialized countries and the exploitation of the labor force in the developing countries. This is now, it shows that this was wrong, because now the supply lines don't function. In the same way, this whole idea of going to the stock exchange, money makes money, shareholder value society. If you look at the result of it, you can see that the billionaires became more and richer, more millionaires, but the large parts of the population has become poorer. The middle level class is almost not existent. The low end of the income bracket, people can't make ends meet anymore. So this system is absolutely bankrupt, and the central banks right now are caught between a rock and a hard place, because they have now started to increase the interest rate in order to fight the inflation. But that risks immediately a chain reaction of bankruptcies from highly indebted firms, from emerging markets who suffer capital flight because of the interest rate policy of the central banks of the so-called advanced sector. And this will not get better within this system. You need a complete reorganization of this system. Essentially the same thing what Franklin D. Roosevelt did in 1933. And therefore, we have issued now this call to have an emergency conference for New Bretton Woods, and we are collecting signatures. So I'm actually calling on you, our viewers, please sign this call, and not only sign it if you agree with it naturally, but circulate it widely, because this is urgent. This is not something for the long term, but action must be taken very soon.
And Helga, you mentioned the importance of the bankruptcy of the neoliberal model. I think it's no more clear than in Biden saying that the cause of inflation is Putin and Putin's war. And then you have Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, saying, no, that's not true. It happened before that. And then he said it has to do with supply chains and COVID, leaving out the whole question of the tremendous volume of money chasing after worthless financial paper. I think one of the important things about your call is it gets at the question of what is real economics.
Yes. Obviously, the idea that the war has caused the inflation is really a very meager fig leaf. It's the result of this enormous pumping of trillions of dollars in yen and euros since the already systemic collapse of the system 2007, 2008, which was just papered over by pumping all of this liquidity into the system. And now it appears as a hyperinflation. Now, I think the idea, that you can count wealth in the form of money is one of the fairy tales which really need to be debunked once and for all. because the only thing which really counts is those things which increase the productivity of the living standard, the production, the labor force, and that is definitely something which has been run down to the point that you see it everywhere. You see it in the United States and also in Europe. The number of infrastructure which is rotting away, insecure bridges, repairs take 10 years. In China, they would take a week. And you have this complete lack of, skilled labor for certain categories. There has been no attention to invest in those things which make the economy function. And we are paying all a very bitter price now. And that's why the kind of reorganization we are calling for is more urgent than ever.
Now, it's also clear that there is a completely different approach from the transatlantic system and from Russia, China, and the global south. There are two summits taking place this week. You have the Brics Summit, which is already underway, and then you have the European Union Summit coming up. Say something about that, the differences that we're seeing. I mean, there are some very phenomenal speeches being given at the Brics Summit.
Yes, I would say so. And I can only advise you to actually read these speeches in the full length, because you will never find out from the media what these extraordinary leaders are saying, And I would say that the combination of President Xi Jinping, Putin, Modi, Rhamaposa from South Africa, and even Bolsonero is, saying useful things in this context. And, they are expressing very clearly that they feel that in this situation, they have to take responsibility for the stability in the world. And, also Xi Jinping talked about a whole new era of economic development. And Putin, for example, said that the weaponization of the economy has resulted in a situation where the Brics countries are actually creating a new international currency based on a basket of Brics currencies and others. What he means by weaponization of the economy is, the confiscation of assets of other countries by mainly the United States, but also some European banks, of money from Venezuela, from Iran, from Afghanistan, naturally recently the 300 billion from Russia. Now that has a huge backlash effect, because, if you go around and take the assets people have parked in your own banks and just, confiscate them, well, then you should not be surprised if the trust in your own currency and in your own banking system is eroding very quickly, and therefore these countries are in the process of creating a completely different financial and economic system. So I think this was a very important summit, and I think they are now inviting more countries from the developing countries. They already had last year several countries joined the Bank of the Brics, the new development bank. And now there are many candidates of countries who want to formally join the Brics in the coming period. So this is already a big alternative system. The Brics in their present form represent 40% of the world population, more than 25% of the entire economic production. And this is growing fast. So, there are some countries who do not want to cave in anymore. The coercion coming from the West, that's actually what President Rhamaposa from South Africa said explicitly. They also reject the sanctions policy. And so we have quite an interesting situation. And, that is not, the solution, obviously, because the very aggressive decoupling, which is going on from the United States, Great Britain, the EU towards Russia, totally, and also increasingly against China, this is creating a very dangerous split in the world, where the Europeans and the US are not looking good at all.
Now, in addition to these summits of the EU and the BRICS, we have the G7 and then the NATO summit coming up, where it seems as though the whole intent of NATO is to continue pouring arms into Ukraine and to expand NATO. Clearly, this is more provocations piled on top of each other, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, what they did at the EU summit, they made Ukraine and Moldavia candidates for joining the EU. Von der Leyen is pushing to have that done as quickly as possible. But, if the EU does not want to dissolve itself, they have to stick to their own rules. And by that standard, Ukraine is very far away from matching all of these requirements, democracy and many other things. But it's clearly a provocation, and it's a consolidation of the mistake which was made 2008 at the Bucharest summit, promising Ukraine and Georgia to become NATO members. And, given the fact that the EU does have a clause like NATO of solidarity in case one is attacked, the others have to come militarily to help. And the fact that the EU, since the Lisbon Treaty and NATO, and most countries are in both, are overlapping so much that, it doesn't really matter if you join the EU or join NATO. It's definitely not a good development at all. Well, and then naturally the Madrid G7 meeting is supposed to, again, line up the so-called democracies against the autocracies, this really stupid categorization. And at the Madrid summit, from all indications, Stoltenberg wants to present a new security doctrine for NATO, focusing very much on the rivalry with Russia, and China emphatically for the first time also mentioned, and a plan to have a global NATO by extending it to the Indo-Pacific. And that is understood by China in particular as a clear attempt to encircle China. And this is also very, very, problematic.
Well, I think one of the interesting things that came out was this report from RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, on the need for an industrial war economy. It was an American lieutenant colonel who wrote the paper. But what he pointed out is that the West is running out of ammunition, that there's not significant industrial production. And in a sense, by talking about the weakness of NATO in dealing with the Russian military, they're pointing to the weakness of the collapse of physical economy in the West. But I don't think there's any solution that they have, is there?
No, I mean, it is a blatant call for retooling the economy into a complete war economy, very bellicose. I mean, the report mentions that the entire artillery, which is being produced in the United States in 1 year, is being presently used up in Ukraine in 10 to 14 days. I mean, so if you want to have artillery for the whole year, you can forget producing anything else but this war production. It's terrible. It's a mania. It shows you the mindset of these people. They're not, I mean, look, right now you have the German economy completely in a free fall. What this Habeck is doing is murderous for the German industry. Where do you have the outcry where, large corporation chiefs or, politicians would basically intervene and say, we have to stop this, we have to save Germany as an industrial nation? It does not exist. These calls do not come out. And why? Obviously there is a hidden agenda. And I think the fact that there is also no more a discussion about a diplomatic solution for the Ukraine crisis, and the fact that they are completely ignoring the self-interest of Germany as an industrial nation, they go together. And I think the population better wakes up. I mean, we are being governed right now by governments who are absolutely not defending the interest of the common good. And they're, in my view, all violating their oaths that they have to safeguard the interest of the people and protect them against dangers. So it's really a situation where the ordinary citizen is called upon to utter his voice or her voice and force a change of policy.
I think it's also quite noteworthy that while both the BRICS and the G7 are talking about development, the development policy they're talking about for the G7, for the EU, is green. And that's one of the things that's driving away the developing sector nations that actually want real economic development. Now, in that context, war buildup doesn't do anything to help countries that need to develop. Now, coming back to the war, there's Scott Ritter made a very interesting statement. I think I pair it with what Colonel Douglas Macgregor said, where Macgregor said the war is over, Ukraine is lost. And then Scott Ritter said, well, if Russia wins, this is the end of NATO. Do you think that's a accurate assessment?
Well, I tend to agree with that, and I would for sure hope it, because NATO is an obsolete institution which should have been dissolved when the Warsaw Pact dissolved in 91. And in the meantime, they have only turned into an aggressive force by their continued expansions to the east, ever closer to the borders of Russia. And I think, there is a lot of disunity in NATO. Not every country agrees with these policies, and there were even calls to postpone the summit in Madrid in order not to have these frictions show. So, I think, there is also a very interesting situation in France, where, the two blocks, right and left of Macron, namely the combination of left parties around Mélenchon and on the left, and then also the votes which Le Pen got. Both of these right and left blocks, if I want to call it that way, in lacking for a better notion, they are for France to leave the integrated command of NATO. So Macron for sure will go to the NATO summit in a much weakened condition. And I think that, given the fact that the whole social ferment is reappearing, I think we are heading for a very hot summer and hot fall. I mean, you saw already that in Great Britain, you had a rail strike, you had several other trade unions on strike, which was played down by the media in an amazing way. Obviously, they are afraid to report this trade. Then in Holland, you had already 40,000 farmers protesting against that they have no access to affordable fertilizer. And, you have a similar social ferment brewing everywhere. So if these policies are not changed to the better in the way we propose, we could face a very hot social situation in the short term. And I think NATO, for sure, is one subject, because in some of these demonstrations, for example, in Brussels, there were 80,000 people demonstrating against NATO and against inflation, putting the two issues in one. And I think this is a pre-taste of more things which could come very quickly.
And when you talk about social ferment, we see the same potential in the United States, but it comes out in a different way in some cases because of the generation of the culture. We're seeing it in terms of a violent culture, a nihilism, a lack of respect for human dignity. This is a product of the neoliberalism combined with the war policy, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it was Ramsey Clark, the late Justice Minister, Attorney General of the Johnson administration, who used to be very close to us. He actually pointed to the fact that and he quoted Martin Luther King in several occasions, that the United States had already then become the most violent country on the planet. And I think there is a parallel between the violence in foreign policy, all these interventionist wars, the conduct in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, and the domestic violence. And it has something to do with the philosophy. For example, if you read Samuel Huntington, The Soldier and the State, there he actually praises it if the soldier is as cold-blooded as possible and has as little to do with the population. All of these are developments coming from, Cliff Kirakoff at our conference attributed to the influence of Nietzsche. You could say it's the Leo Strauss influence in the leading layers in the United States. But, fortunately, this is not the entire United States, but there is a growing opposition, most beautifully expressed in the election campaign of Diane Sayre and Joël de John, but especially Diane Sayre, managed to collect far more than 45,000 signatures, and she is now the only independent candidate on the ballot for Senate in New York. Now, this is a miracle. I mean, to do that, these increased requirements were designed to prevent any independent candidate to achieve such a position as a candidate. But Diane was able to mobilize all segments of the population. She had, I think, altogether 200 activists who helped her to collect these signatures. And there's also another case of a Democrat who won the primaries in Kentucky, who also spoke at our conference. And he also won on a ticket on a program condemning the money to Ukraine, weapons to Ukraine, and against NATO. So these are hopeful signs that that there is the other America, the real America, awakening. And this is why I called my presentation at the conference Mission Impossible, to win Mission Impossible or look for another planet. And what I meant by that is we have to get the United States and Europe off this present confrontation course and get them to join with Russia, with China, and with the Brics and many other nations in a development program. We have not given up that intention. And, if you recognize that it is necessary to change the policy of the United States, some people think it's impossible, but in times like this, where you have a breakdown of all institutions, it counts, if you have powerful ideas. And, for the sake of world peace, this has to occur. So join our efforts.
And Helga, toward that end, you made this, you drafted this call for a conference, a new Bretton Woods conference, in which we're essentially insisting that the United States has to return to its American system tradition of reaching out and working with other countries when you have much of the world moving in this direction. So people should, I assume this is going to be on the website in the next hours, right?
Yes. Be there already.
Okay, so it's there already. You've just gotten your marching orders. Download it, read it, circulate it, and study it, because it does include a very clear picture of what the American system is. So Helga, anything else you want to add at the end?
No, but get active with us. I mean, that's the best you can do for our all future.
That's good advice. So until next week, Helga, thanks for joining us this week. We'll see you then.
Till next week.